To the left, we have the Sony A80L. To the right, we have the Samsung S95B. So we're just going to dive right into it by telling you what we see on the screen right now. So the colors on the Sony A80L are not anywhere near as nice as we have on the Samsung S95B. Now I want to talk particularly about the color red. This often comes up in a lot of my videos and I never really get the chance to dive fully into it without boring a few people. So I'm going to try to make it faster this time around by just showing you the red to the left is just not saturated. It looks very pukey and it doesn't look like red, where the flower to the right looks a lot more like the flower we would actually see in the real world. Shifting colors to the color blue, if we look at the iris, we can clearly see that there is a lot more depth. It's like looking into an entirely new universe of color on the S95B to the right versus the Sony A80L. Now, full disclosure, both TVs have been fully adjusted and optimized to take advantage of the most these TVs are capable of pushing out. These are not out-of-the-box settings. If you want my settings, make sure you join and I've got you covered. But the point being is that this is pushing exactly what you paid for, right? To see the most, like its top capability. Can't go any higher. The Sony still can't compete with the S95B in terms of that color output. And if you want to replicate this yourself, make sure you go to 4K Demo Sony XR Tech Film A90K and OLED TV 2022. It's a demo, but the channel's name is TechZ Official. Honestly, it won't be very hard to find this video, but that's what I'm using, so you can replicate it using this exact video if you want to. So we're going to go ahead and hit play, and we're going to do this for two reasons. One, you can see how YouTube processing works with both of these TVs, and two, you're able to see exactly what I'm talking about in real time. So as this plays out, you're going to notice that again, the Sony has the more muted color paletry. Now, I've been complaining about this for years. Sony is known as being color accurate and oh, it's so amazing, but it's really not though. And this isn't a knock on Sony. This just, I mean, like, look at this. Pause right here, just full pause. That's supposed to be red. That is not red, right? I don't know what color that's supposed to be to Sony, but that is not red, and they really do have to fix that. So these kinds of highlighting examples are what I like to show you. And another thing I want to show you is even though they're both OLED, the Sony is less clear in this example on this paused frame. I'm just noticing a less clear image where there's a lot more contrast coming through on the Samsung S95B to a dramatic extent, to the point where I would not want the Sony, like, at all. And the relevancy of this is right now the Sony A80L, 55 to 55, both these are 55 inches, right? $1,700 plus. The Samsung S95B, like $1,200, and I picked it up on sale at $997 when they were doing that like pre-Father's Day sale or whatever it was. Mother's Day, I don't care. I don't remember, but I mean, you can get what I'm saying. I mean, look at that flower. That's not a red flower, right? Like that's kind of trash. Now, it's not to say that Sony is always terrible and that they can't do anything to redeem themselves, but like, this is their demo. This was supposed to make their TV look as good as it could possibly ever look, and they're actually getting baked by another manufacturer on their own demo. Like, let that sink in. Now, I know what you must be thinking, Quantum, be fair. That's a Sony demo, so show us a Samsung on the Sony. So here we have one of my favorite demos of all time back from 2015, the Samsung Journey of Color 4K demo. You can find it on the 4K Media demo channel, and I highly recommend you try it out because this will show you what I'm talking about. I mean, if this pause frame doesn't just show you a lot more depth in the horizon and realistic color, pay it close attention. The color right here is very realistic to what we'd see on the ocean, where this is just a really oversaturated kind of shade of blue, doesn't really look very accurate. The red, forget about it, not as nice as what we have on Samsung, which of course this demo is going to highlight even further. Now again, the boats, as you're clearly seeing, that boat is just terrible on the Sony. And again, this is what I mean with blood orange. Like, that is not red. I don't know, again, what they're thinking it is, but that is not red. So that's one of my biggest gripes. Now again, I don't really like how Samsung in this scene is darkening everything more or less. Like, the whole general scene is darker now than what we have on the Sony, where that's more realistic. It feels like the sun's beaming down on her in the boat, but the color red, like, come on, what is that really? Now, as this demo progresses, they do tend to look very identical, but yellows on the Sony, way better than what we have on the Samsung. Like, way better. Samsung just tends to struggle a bit more with producing most shades of yellow, and I think that's gonna be indicative of, I don't know, maybe tech differences. I really couldn't tell you why Samsung's, they go more towards like almost like a highlighter yellow for their yellows versus like just normal yellow. So it's something they need to work on for sure. Again, this scene right here, like, forget about it though. When we switch back again to the conversation of red, Red is one of the most primary colors, right? I mean, there are three of them. You've got three jobs to do: red, green, and blue. Like, and from that you can branch off and make a beautiful pageantry of color almost everywhere. They're getting blue very wrong. Now, in terms of everything else, I think I mean, there's not really much you can really say, right? Like, as you see, the contrast is much higher. Clarity is much higher on the S95B. And again, we're talking about Sony coming out and asking for substantially more than what the competitors are offering. So in that sense, you're paying more money, but is it really worth it, kind of thing? And the answer is immediately no. Like, if we pause this frame right here, you can clearly see the red dress, not really red on the Sony. Again, you're paying top dollar for that Sony name, and it's not justified, because here you go. You have right now $1,200 bucks right now. And again, on sale, $999, $997, S95B, the better picture, quantum.OLED. That's where it's at. I can see more clarity. The grass looks more realistic on the Samsung. It doesn't look pale and washed out. And the Sony is just, in general, targeting more washed out color. And again, this scene's gonna probably be very hard to show, but again, the color blue and all that looks like very, very off. Like that red, I'm not joking, like it's really off. Now, I mean, I wanted to pause that frame, but I don't really see a point because this one's going to come up. And again, we can compare skin tones. Now, there are some things I want to point out that Samsung is doing both right and wrong. So in essence, Sony is too flat. Like, they don't have enough contrast kicking out in their image. It's very washed out comparatively to the QD-OLED by a lot. And it just is less immersive and less striking. I immediately gravitate towards the Samsung. Though Samsung tends to have a little bit more pink, I would say, to the overall hue comparatively to the Sony. Now, again, these things will change depending on your panel. Panel variances are a thing. So going back and forth, you are going to have to weigh up, like, you know, that is a factor. But ultimately speaking, you're going to notice the difference between one versus the other. And you can't really, I mean, it's really difficult to say, like, you prefer one or the other. I mean, if you like less pink in the skin, then you're probably gonna like Sony skin tone representation better. But I'm telling you, looking at the images, that doesn't look great. Now I'm gonna run this frame back just a little bit, and there is something I do want to talk about because it is very important. The geometry here on the Sony is better than what we have on the Samsung. So again, it's not like the cognitive processor isn't doing anything of value. It is now rendering geometry a lot sharper, so its algorithm is honing in on like literally every detail in the column. So before, not a lot of clarity, not a lot of contrast. That stuff does tend to change depending on what you're looking at. As you're seeing here, as this scene kind of opens up, all of that is way clearer on the Sony. That's clean, all of it. Very beautiful. And again, that's one of the nice things about the Sony. Now, of course, now Samsung is starting to pull ahead. But again, like on the jewels especially, like that is just tack sharp, razor sharp on the Samsung S95B. I don't know if I said Sony before, but the S95B is pulling right next to them in terms of clarity and surpassing them in this example as well, where now the Sony is looking very like pale, muted, washed out, and it's just not the more aesthetically pleasing display to look at. And this is something that you're going to experience time and time again. Now, one thing about Samsung, again, going back to be in the interest of course, fairness, Samsung is struggling greatly when we talk about the rendition of the color green from time to time, foliage being their biggest weakness where it can look almost fluorescent by comparison. It needs to be more muted down in these areas where it's just oversaturated in some points that you can't really get out, lacking gradation. And that just means for people who don't do the tech talk, you know, again, it's not gradating to like the lighter shades of green like it should. It's just one flat shade of green, and that is wrong, that is inaccurate, and that is something Samsung rather needs to work on. Again, counteractively, Sony this year with those reds, I don't even know what that trash is supposed to be. With those flower petals over there, like what even is that? Like I don't understand what they're doing. But again, these little differences, as you can see, go back and forth over and over again. And so we're gonna switch to something else and show you guys some more stuff. As we talk about gaming, that's one of the more touchier subjects for a lot of people because Sony this year, of course, again, do not have all 4 ports of HDMI 2.1 greatness. This matters because Sony is advertising themselves as like the best place to play PS5. Like they are just saying, hey, we're the TV that you get when you have a PS5 and then all is great in the world. But what they're not telling you is the experience that's, you know, kind of going to go lacking and not having all 4 ports of HDMI 2.1. So that's something you have to figure out if that's your setup, okay? Also, another problem is, again, we are missing a lot of color. I don't know if you've noticed this, but we're going to go back here, okay, to Mr. Fisk. Okay, and we're just gonna pause, just like right here, and just the tie, okay? I don't know how well this is gonna show on YouTube, to be fair, but I will say that there is just such a lack of purple on the Sony where it just looks like it's it looks like a decade old. Like that tie looks like he pulled it out of the trash or something. Versus, you know, the Samsung where it looks like, hey, that's a modern tie, that's what he's wearing, you know. And in that way, you're starting to lose immersion. Purples and like blues and stuff like that on the Sony are not really that great as they should be, which is kind of concerning because, again, it's a WOLED. Blues are supposed to be their strongest suit. And, I mean, red, I mean, I guess we can kind of be like, you're using maybe an older LG panel, which is why maybe your reds suck. And when I say suck, I mean, look, like, why is Spider-Man orange? Like, come on. Like, it's not even remotely like what he's supposed to look like. I mean, we can start the scene all over again where he jumps on the thing and kind of holds on. I mean, look at that. Spider-Man's freaking orange. Like, that is not what he's supposed to look like. That is the wrong shade all day, every day. But again, this is the Sony experience. And again, when things start moving around and getting kind of fast-paced, again, you won't have many problems with the Sony at higher refresh rates, right? It'll be very responsive and very quick and very fluid, very nice, right? But when you start at lower frame rates, that's when the problems start. But I wanted to show you something that's recorded, or more or less that has a 60 FPS rating behind it, or refresh rate behind it, so that you can see, like, you're not going to have any real problems as far as motion on 60 FPS. So the people who are gamers, I mean, in that sense, yes, you do have that nice experience, but also the impact is going to go missing, as you clearly see what I'm talking about in terms of the colors and all that good jazz, so on and so forth. Again, just to talk about motion for a second here, and why I'm saying that the Sony is worse than the Samsung S95B for that. I mean, you're going to notice as they're driving around, there's a lot more jitters on the Sony. It just is a jittery mess, and it's not fun, right? You don't want to be in your game and enjoying, or trying to enjoy it, and then the next thing you know, there's a lot of jitters, and then it's just not smooth. I think one of the best examples is going to be like this scene. So you guys can test this out, but like, let's go to the bridge scene because that was pretty bad on the Sony, and it just will continue to be so, right? Like, they crash, you go under the bridge, chop, 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 chop. It's disgusting on the Sony. You're paying $1,700+ to have that experience. That should not be lost on anybody, okay? We don't have the time or patience to play around nice with a brand because, oh, they've established themselves over how many years. That doesn't matter to us. We're everyday consumers. We're working for our money, and our name isn't on the outside of the Sony headquarters. So we're going to treat them like a brand that needs to work for their place in this world, like everybody else, right? They're not getting any preferential treatment around here. And the reality is, this is not a mindset of other YouTubers. No, I'm not here to put any other YouTubers out. Do your thing, make your money, hustle however you got to. But what I will say is, there is a certain level of honesty that we do have to present, and you're seeing it right here. Sony is just worse for motion. I mean, as you look at this scene, chop, chop, chop on the Sony. It's smoother on the Samsung. I mean, look at the cop cars, for crying out loud. Like, everything that Sony should be doing correctly, they're not. So when they say, hey, we're great for PS5, they really should put a little asterisk there and say, so long as you're gaming at 60 FPS or higher. If you are gaming at 4K 30, which, spoiler, a lot of their first-party story-driven games are going to be 30 FPS again this year, you're going to be experiencing a lot of problems. Now, again, they usually come with a performance mode, but then you have to sacrifice resolution and then take a step down from what you actually paid for. And so the best and perfect place to play on PS5 kind of mantra doesn't really hold up. But again, we did have to compare it. Now, as far as the image quality between the two, they actually look pretty identical color paletry-wise in this example. Obviously, the Samsung pulls ahead a little bit, but the Sony does take a little bit more of the yellow tonalities. So again, they're too similar in this example to really fuss over. I think most people would have a very comparable experience with something muted out and kind of like cinematic like The Matrix. But now that also is important because a lot of people are saying, oh, the Samsung S95B isn't accurate. Well, look at those skin tones. Beautiful skin tones that surpasses what the Sony is doing, which Sony is a little bit more muted. So again, it's never in your best interest to listen to purists try to tell you that something can't look accurate when, again, it's usually just brand bias or some nonsense like that, because you're seeing the Samsung S95B, not only can it look accurate, but it looks damn good in this example here. So again, if we're talking about contrast on the Sony versus the Samsung, I mean, you can clearly see it here in this example. Samsung is just giving you more contrast. And in these scenes where it gets really dark, they remove a lot more of that haze. Now, as we're looking over on the Sony, for whatever reason, there's a lot more haze to it. Now, this is odd because this is a freaking OLED, so it's supposed to be pitch black, no haze, but somehow Sony has found a way to make their picture hazy, which is very odd, and I don't really understand that. Again, this is all in the context comparatively to the Samsung S95B. The Samsung S95B is just clarity central, and you are not wanting for any detail at all. And I think that's important to note because, again, the price is cheaper. So in this example, you can clearly see the Samsung S95B pulling ahead in terms of that clarity that I was talking about earlier. And again, it is stupid clear. Like, it's like crystal clear, three-dimensional, and this is important because Samsung has the real depth enhancer and the Sony has the XR cognitive processor. But I'm telling you right now, when it comes to overall general experiences, Samsung is just more consistent at providing more depth than the Sony. And again, we're comparing apples to apples. So the cognitive experience is just not holding up well against the AI real depth enhancement feature that Samsung is offering. And again, you look at the colors, day and night difference, right? Sony, more washed out. They tend to favor that, and it just keeps getting worse as the years go on. I don't know why they think all of our TVs should look like they're out of 2010, but that's what Sony wants. Whatever, do your thing, but I really would like to see a modern color paletry since we're in the age of BT 2020 and DCI-P3. Maybe show some extra color and effort, and you know, if you're gonna say cognitive and depth and all that stuff, maybe show more than what a 2017 Sony X900E could in terms of depth. Now, something that you have to be careful with the Sony is when we get to scenes or movies or whatever it is that tend to be a little bit blue by nature, Sony is going to make them even more blue than they really are. You can probably see it here. The skin tone in Tron just is off, right? The Samsung S95B able to retain a lot more of the blood in the skin that gives it that warmth or that red glow that it's supposed to have, so you know you're dealing with a human being. And Sony's rocking more of that morgue look. You know, they're trying to give you that vibe that people just are unalive in all of your imagery, and it's just not fun, at least in that aspect. Now again, it's not like Sony is so far off the mark from what Samsung is doing and just destroy the Sony, but I mean, this TV is performing like something that needs to be more at the $800 to $1,000, you know, kind of like budget bin price point, at least. And it's sad we have to say that that's the budget bin price point these days with everything being inflated, but it's kind of the truth. I mean, it needs to be at an entry-level price point for what kind of picture quality they're offering. I would guarantee you even something like the LG B2, you know, B3 could beat this Sony, okay? That's how crappy this Sony is in terms of what you get for what you're paying for. You really, you know, people always have the saying, you get what you pay for, and that's not always the case. So here we're looking at that iconic Jeep and Dorothy from Twister, and you can clearly see the Samsung S95B now, in terms of foliage, is doing a lot better. So again, what I mentioned earlier with foliage, sometimes it's a solid color. That's usually noticed on demos a lot, but in real content, the Samsung does tend to balance out. So that is something I did want to notice, or at least recognize. Now, to be fair, it's like 50-50, it's hit or miss. Sometimes, depending on the color grading choice of the producer, it's just a flat, solid color, and other times, as you see here, it's finely gradated and far surpassing the dead grass on the Sony, and again, at least comparatively, of course. And then, of course, the yellow as well does improve way more, as we see here, versus what we have here on the Sony. So again, it's all about grading, color grading, and the way that things were processed. And again, this is why I always say, chasing director's intent is really kind of stupid, because you're never going to do that. It really does depend on how they graded it, how it was colored in Hollywood and stuff like that and brought to your screen. So the best you can do is have the best settings to give you that look. And again, make sure you join to grab my settings for both of these displays, because that will truly show you what you're missing out on. And if not, by all means, keep watching out of the box, but you're never going to see what these TVs truly can do. So take the chance for $5 and you'll be amazed at what these TVs are truly capable of. And just in case anybody is confused as far as, again, we're talking about accuracy, you can clearly see the Samsung S95B has no problem getting extremely accurate. And this is a reference picture to kind of show you that, again, from portrait displays, calibrators know exactly what they're looking at. Everyday people just will see people, which is fine too. But the point being is that there's no bleeding or, orange people or people looking off. It just is buttoned up really well. And I think that's very important to note here. Unfortunately, though, these issues with Sony where they're just lacking in color, I mean, all the shades of color really just don't look as impressive as they should, and they do look a lot more pale overall. And on the whole, that's the general vibe here. Sony, while being an OLED, exhibits more haze. It is less clear from time to time, unless we're looking at buildings, and then it goes into tack sharp mode. And then again, it's just not as nice as the Samsung S95B, which is cheaper, frankly, has deeper speakers that have bass with them that, again, it sounds very nice. And again, it's just the better TV. I cannot recommend the Sony comparatively. Couldn't fathom why anyone else would. The WOLED technology is old technology at this point. It is not an innovation, and we knew it was going to fall behind. But seeing how the Samsung S95B is comparing against even a new attempt at WOLED is very amazing, because again, we're talking about a last year's TV from 2022 versus 2021, and you're clearly seeing that 2022 is still pulling ahead with QD-OLED, which means QD-OLED is here to stay.